Good morning, VG4, or whatever time of day that you're tuning in. I want to thank you for being part of our online service, our online community. We think about you, we're praying for you, we value you. Thank you for tuning in. Love to hear from you at any time. This week we're celebrating the work that we got to do this weekend in cleaning up our church home together with the Episcopalians and the Battleground Pentecostals who also meet here. We got so much done, and I love the way our church is so servant-hearted together. I want to remind you that today is the deadline for regular price for the women's retreat, which is November 5th to 7th at Rockaway Beach, Twin Rocks Friends Camp. It's going to be a really amazing time. bg4.com. You can sign up there. It's $165 for Friday to Sunday or $70 for a Saturday only. We would love to have you join us. Well, this morning, I get to continue our series on rhythms. And I got a little bit interrupted by the Holy Spirit as I was preparing for this message. I was going a different direction. And I felt like the Lord brought up to me just some cracks and fissures that I'm seeing in relationships, in families, in friendships, and even in our own church. And just the tensions that have come around disagreements about some very public issues in the last few months. So I don't want you to get scared. I'm hoping that you will give me the benefit of the doubt and come with me. And if we achieve our goal this morning, I'm hoping that every person listening will feel more welcome and more loved. And that's the goal. We want to remember that we are a welcoming church. We can be an opinionated church at times and have differing opinions, but we are a welcoming church because we want to welcome like Jesus welcomes. So when I was in middle school, I had an experience of being an outsider that I won't forget. And it probably shaped some of my strong feelings about wanting to make sure people feel welcome. We lived in a small town and my dad was the superintendent of schools, and there's a fair amount of public pressure on that job. And it was a contentious time. There was a recession. There were budget cuts. There were lots of opinions about how that should be handled. And sometimes all of that contention and disagreement got personal towards my dad and towards our family. Well, things kind of came to a head in my 8th grade year. My parents decided to pull us out of a traditional schooling and put us on homeschool. We were still part of the school district. Like Battleground, there was a large homeschool population that was registered with the school district, but we weren't going to school in the traditional way. And at that time, it was a little more controversial. So one certain day, I went in with my mom to shop at the general store that was the main place that everyone in the community shopped and owned by parents of a school friend of mine. And I stopped dead in my tracks in front of the front door because there was a handmade poster that said, "Do you disagree with our superintendent's job performance? Do you disapprove of his decision to pull his kids out of school? Speak out." I remember freezing, being totally taken off guard because we were just going grocery shopping and wanting to turn around and go back to the car. But my mom resolutely opened the door and went in to buy her groceries, and I went with her. But that was a moment that's burned in my mind when I realized I'm an outsider in this community. It's us versus them, and we are them. And I'll never forget the way that felt. There's a second experience that I was thinking of as I was preparing this morning. Kind of captures a different emotion, but also relevant to the conversation. Rick and I were in love. We were planning to get married, and we come from different cultural backgrounds. Rick grew up in a very particular niche. It's Russian Pentecostal. He spoke Russian at church. He spoke Spanish at home, and if that doesn't make sense to you, you should ask Rick to explain it to you later. But our cultural backgrounds were different. I grew up dancing my heart out at weddings and sure that I wanted to have a dance party when I got married. Rick's family, especially certain cousins, really disapproved of dancing. They were from a really strict background. And so we compromised and we decided that we would have a father-daughter dance and we would have a first dance, but we wouldn't have like a general dance party. And that felt like a bit of a sacrifice. But what shocked me was on the day of our wedding, we had this really cool like jazz quartet. We did this dance not very well. And some of Rick's cousins stood up and walked out of our wedding reception to protest and voice their disapproval that we would dare dance at our own wedding with each other. And I just felt like offended. I felt like I wanted to defend myself. Like just because I danced with my husband doesn't mean that I'm on a slippery slope to loose morality. Yet they had already left, and so there was nothing that I could say. But that was a moment when I felt wrongfully judged. So those are two different experiences, and I'm guessing that you relate to at least one of them. A moment when I felt like an outsider in the community, and a moment when I felt judged. Even though I was in the majority, we stayed, but it hurt that people walked out and judged something I thought was perfectly fine as being wrong. Well, what do you do when you feel judged? What do you feel when you get sideways glances from people? If you're a parent, you've had this happen at the grocery store. I guarantee it, when your kids start monkeying around or climbing. When someone disagrees with us about an issue, it can easily feel like we are being personally rejected. And so this morning, we're going to look at Romans 14. It's a 2,000-year-old letter to the church in Rome, but it feels so relevant today. It has instructions about what to do when we don't see eye to eye with people. And there have been some really contentious issues happening in our time this year in our community. And I'm wondering if you know some of the things going on in the lives of people right here in our church and in our community. Some in our community are facing job loss because for any number of reasons, they don't want to be vaccinated. And we are grieving with them for this transition that they weren't looking for. Some in our community are facing this severe uptick in workload because people have left due to the vaccine mandate. I'm thinking a lot of our nurses and doctors and other medical professionals who are carrying a giant workload because of the shifts in their profession. And we're praying for strength for them. Some in our church have lost family members to COVID. We did a funeral last weekend. Some have come close to losing family members to COVID, and they may feel very sensitive about people taking precautions. Makes sense when you know their stories. For every person in this room, there's a story that informs their personal convictions. They make sense. My question is this: how can we both stay true to our own personal convictions and still hold on to love and unity and to welcoming people at BG4? As well as welcoming families and friends and neighbors as we move throughout our life. The Bible, you may be shocked to find out, has nothing direct to say about vaccines. The word vaccine, shockingly, it's not in the Bible. But the Bible has plenty to say about love. It has plenty to say about how we serve and listen to each other. Vaccines might fall into what Paul calls disputable issues. These are issues where good believers who are following Jesus think differently. So we need to lean into what the Bible says about how to love and serve and listen to each other when we disagree. Paul wrote the book of Romans in the city of Corinth in AD 56 or 57. Now, there's a really interesting background to all of this, and I hope you'll stay with me because I think you'll find it relevant. So Paul came to Corinth probably in about AD 50. And in AD 49, the Emperor Claudius had kicked all the Jews out of Rome. He blamed some things that had happened in the city of Rome on the Jewish population, and he expelled them from Rome. And Paul met Priscilla and Aquila, who were pastors in Corinth and in Ephesus and in Rome. He met them right after they had experienced this bigotry and they'd been kicked out of their home in Rome. It wasn't an isolated occurrence. It was the third time in recent history that a Roman emperor had kicked all the Jews out of Rome. It happened in 143 BC and in AD 19, and then again in AD 49. It's like a regular cycle of blaming Jewish people in Rome. Priscilla and Aquila, at the time that they received the book of Rome, the letter to Romans, they were back in Rome and they were pastoring a church of both Romans and Jews. But if you can imagine being a Jewish person living in Rome in AD 56, just 7 years before, you had been evicted, lost property, lost connection, blamed for things that were going wrong. Would you really let your guard down, or would you always feel like you were probably an outsider, maybe not wanting to let your identity be known and never really feeling like you truly belonged? That is the background to what Jewish people were experiencing in Rome at the time that this was written, and it's really important. Because when things got tough in Rome, Jews got blamed. But now the church in Rome was growing. It was also made up of lots of mainstream Romans. Originally, it had been mostly Jewish people. And they were fully enculturated in the food, in the culture, and in the habits of Rome because they were Romans. So something totally unprecedented was happening. Throughout human history, it's been really normal for different ethnic groups to kind of segregate within cities. Even today, you'd find a Jewish butcher, Jewish deli in certain neighborhoods and a synagogue, and the same thing was true in Rome. But because of what Jesus did, we had Gentiles, Romans, trying to live and share space with Jewish people. And it was something they really hadn't tried to do before. It was totally new, and they were running into certain challenges. And that's what Paul's speaking to. One of the most controversial issues, and it's kind of hard for us to wrap our brains around why they would care this much, but one of the most controversial issues was about the food that they ate, about meat, about being vegetarian or eating meat. But there was a whole cultural issue behind this. The Jews in Rome had a fair amount of cultural issues to work through when it came to meat in Rome. Often they couldn't get kosher meat, and so it might have even seemed a little bit disgusting to them to have meat with blood in it. It was just not how they were raised. They were raised to avoid it. They also had been raised to totally avoid anything that had to do with idolatry. And often in Rome, animals were sacrificed to Roman gods, and then the meat was recycled and sold for dinner. The Romans had no problem with that. They'd been doing it their whole life. They knew they weren't worshiping those gods, but they didn't have problems eating the meat that came out of it. They were willing to reap those benefits. But the Jewish people had kept their own identity by being very strict about not getting involved with anything that had to do with idolatry and following their dietary laws and all of those things. Now, Paul had taught them that to be in Jesus, you didn't have to follow dietary laws, but there were still cultural things going on that made Jewish people more comfortable in general, eating one way, and Roman people more comfortable another way. And culture wars were threatening to pull the church apart. Some Jewish Christians were looking at Roman Christians as worldly and compromised. Roman Christians looked at the Jewish Christians as being maybe lower class and small-minded and making a big deal out of nothing. The church was being threatened that it might just separate into ghettos of like-minded people rather than a spacious place where people could worship Jesus together. Are you seeing any parallels to our day and our time? When we disagree about an issue, it's easy to end up feeling like we're personally rejected. Let's read Romans 14 together. Accept other believers who are weak in faith and don't argue with them about what is right or wrong. For instance, one person believes it's all right to eat anything, but another believer with a sensitive conscience will eat only vegetables. Those who feel free to eat anything must not look down on those who don't. And those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do, for God has accepted them. Who are you to condemn someone else's servants? Their own master will judge whether they stand or fall. And with the Lord's help, they will stand, and they will receive his approval. For we don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. If we live, it's to honor the Lord. And if we die, it's to honor the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Christ died and rose again for this very reason, to be Lord of both the living and the dead. So, why do you condemn another believer? Why do you look down on another believer? Remember, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For the scripture says, "As surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bend to me, every tongue will declare allegiance to God." So today we're talking about the fact that when Christians disagree, we welcome the person and leave the issue to God. What does it mean to welcome the person? Paul says, accept other believers. So I love this word accepted. I dug into it a little bit. Accept means to pull someone alongside of you, like you would link arms and walk with them. It's a word for friendship. This person is not ahead of you. They're not behind you or above you or below you. They're right next to you, arm in arm. There's a mutuality to it. There's a respect as friends. And there's a closeness. We're doing life together. That's what it means to welcome or accept someone. Here's the really cool thing. Verse 3 of Romans 14 says that God has accepted us. He has linked arms with us. He has called us his friends. And it's something I can't even fully wrap my mind around. But God's pulled us to him. Accepting or welcoming another person the way that God welcomes means we focus on the big picture. We see them as a person. We don't see them as just a vegetarian or a carnivore. And we don't see them as just a masker. We don't see them as an anti-vaxxer. We don't see them by their political party. We welcome who God made them to be. You see people the way that God does. Paul chooses the words weak and strong, and they're a little more evident in some other translations. And I want to give you a little context. It might sound a little demeaning that some would be called weak, but that really wasn't where Paul was going with this. Scott McKnight does a great job explaining how this relates to the Jewish minority and the Gentile majority in Rome. And I think it gives us tools for any debate that comes into the church that threatens to tear us apart. Rather than using just Jews and Gentiles, he uses these more general words, weak and strong, so we can apply it to our own situation. The strong represents the vocal majority. And then in Rome, that was the Gentile or Roman Christians. They had more rights and privileges, and they were the majority. And then the weak represented the Jewish minority. They had the dissenting opinion, and sometimes they felt like they were being pushed to the margins and their voice wasn't being heard. That's why Paul uses the word weak, not to demean them. He doesn't call for anyone to give up on their convictions, but he calls them to hold those convictions with love and with grace for other people. We welcome dissenting opinions. That's what it means to accept the weak. In this context, as I said, the weak were the Jewish Christians. Their voice felt like it was getting drowned out sometimes because there were less of them. And they didn't have a lot of influence in Rome or in the government. So it was tempting for the Romans to kind of be condescending and dismiss them and say their concerns were totally unimportant. To say, because I don't have a problem with eating meat that's been from a Roman temple, you shouldn't have a problem with it either. You need to grow up and get over it. And that kind of attitude would tear the church apart. In our cultural moment, some might feel that because they don't have a problem with mandates or with different things that are going on in this moment regarding the challenges that we're facing, they might dismiss other people's concerns as unimportant and want them to just get over it. We run the risk of becoming condescending or dismissive about that, especially when we feel like we have more people on our side. Like me in front of the general store, when you are a person who has a dissenting opinion, you can start to feel called out as an outsider, like you don't belong. And I truly believe that most people don't need you to agree with them. They just want you to make room for them. We want to belong. So we don't have to agree on every issue, but we need to let people know that they are welcome and that they belong. We need to leave room for people who think differently than us. That's where Paul talks about accepting the strong. Now, the temptation for the Jewish Christians was to be really judgmental about the Roman Christians. Why couldn't they sacrifice a cheeseburger to avoid pagan temples? They had sound reasons, the Jewish people did in their history, to avoid compromise with the main idolatrous culture. It's why they still survived as a people. But their temptation was to really judge harshly the Roman Christians who felt more free to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Paul challenges believers, Jewish believers who had these strong convictions, not to give up on their own personal convictions, but to make room for other people, to give them grace, that God could still be at work in their life. Again, most people don't need you to approve of everything they do, but they need to be welcome. They need to know they have a place and they belong. We all want that. We need to see the big picture. Remember the resurrection. In verse 11, Paul zooms out. This is a rather minor issue. He's talking about being vegetarians versus eating meat. And for those of us 2,000 years later, it's hard for us to even understand how this could have been so important. But I can also imagine the early church trying to understand why things that have to do with masks and vaccines would be so important to us right now. And so we also need this camera to zoom out so we're not so micro-focused on one issue. And we need to remember what's going on at a cosmic level. Paul reminds them that Jesus is Lord of the living and the dead because he died and he rose again. He's Lord of people who have already died. He's Lord of people that are alive. He's Lord of vegetarians and he's Lord of carnivores. And guess what? He's Lord of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Jesus is Lord of all. And only Jesus' opinion ultimately matters. The Romans understood absolute authority because they lived next door to Caesar. And whatever Caesar said, that was the final word because he had absolute authority. And Paul reminds them that Jesus alone, above Caesar, has absolute authority. So we ask ourselves, what's Jesus's opinion? Do we know it? Because we could be wrong about a whole lot of things, and I can almost guarantee that I'm wrong about the way I see many things because I just don't have all the information. So what do we know about Jesus' opinion? We know Jesus' opinion on one very important thing. We know that he has already decided about people who are believers in Jesus, that he has already decided that they are fully forgiven, that they are fully accepted, and they are fully embraced and welcomed by God. And I don't want to stand in the way of that. I don't want to find myself on the opposite side of Jesus' opinion. I want you to picture you are standing before Jesus and he is embracing you and welcoming you home. Now, what if I'm standing to the side and I'm saying, yeah, but Jesus, did you remember about this thing that person did wrong? And I didn't like their political views or their stance on this. I can't imagine arguing with Jesus about his acceptance of another believer. So that means that even right now, I want to remember to keep my mouth shut. I want to be on Jesus' side. I want to side with him. And he has already decided that you are completely accepted and completely loved and completely welcomed by God. It's settled. So leave the issues to God. We live in an incredibly distrustful time. David Brooks wrote an essay in The Atlantic that I thought was so insightful last fall. And he talked a lot about just the way that trust has broken down in our society in the last 10 years. And he gives these statistics. Explosive distrust is the belief that those who disagree with you are not just wrong, but illegitimate. In 1997, 64% of Americans had a good or great deal of trust in the political competence of their fellow citizens. Today, only a third of Americans feel that way. We went from 2/3 to 1/3 who feel that the people that they live with and go to work with have civic competence. Our trust has broken down. It's pulled churches apart. I watched just a tiny bit, as much as I could handle, of CNN and of Fox this week. And let me tell you that listening to both networks, I heard language that sounded angry and incredibly distrustful and dramatic and ascribing evil intent to people that disagreed with the person that was speaking on that network. And I'm not suggesting that we should stop getting news, we should stop saying current, but I want to ask you, who is forming your rhythms? Who is discipling you? Are you hearing more from a network or are you hearing more from Jesus? Because I want Jesus to give me the rhythms and define the way that I look at other people and other believers. I want to assume the other person's motives are good. Verse 8 says that we live to honor the Lord. That's assuming good intent to people on both sides of that controversial issue. Paul says that believers live and die and do everything in between to honor God. How would it change the way we look at other people if we truly believed that those who are getting vaccinated are doing so because they are trying to love their neighbor? And those who are choosing not to get vaccinated are doing so because they in some way want to honor God with their body and they don't feel comfortable with that. What if we believed the best about other people that maybe don't have the same opinion we do? Each believer answers personally to Jesus. Paul says that we will give a personal account to Jesus at the end of time. Guess what? He is not going to ask me about you. He's not going to ask me about why you did or did not get vaccinated or why I didn't change your opinion. He's going to ask me if I loved well. He's going to ask me if I obeyed everything that I believed he was asking me to do. And he's going to ask me if I served the people around me. And I want to focus more attention on that and less on judging others. I'm a person that sometimes needs to be reminded that the world is not waiting for my opinion. I don't have to have an opinion about everything, and that is freeing. What I need to do is obey what God is saying to me and love people well. So I have strong convictions, and we walk in love. At BG4, we grow relationally connected Christians, and we value both welcome and honesty. And I want to paint a picture. What if our church was known as a place where people were welcomed? And you could have strong opinions, and you wouldn't feel like you were being shut down or not included. What if the church was known as the place in town where people who disagree about all sorts of issues loved each other really well? Where it was safe to voice your opinion, to learn from other people. What if we were known for this kind of countercultural love? In our rhythm series, we always say try it and practice it. And this week's challenge is to be a humble listener. It's another rhythm of relationship. My challenge to you is that you would invite someone to coffee and conversation that you know sees some things differently than you do. And you would commit to not even sharing your opinion unless you were asked. And you do 3 things. I'm going to put them up right now. You would ask that person their story. People make sense when you hear their experiences. You would ask them their why. Why do they think the way they do about the issue? Listen for that personal connection to their experiences, their story, and their convictions. Maybe you can affirm, even if you don't agree with them, that that makes more sense to you in hearing their story. And then finally, affirm your friendship. This is where we come back to Romans 14, that welcome. Tell them that they make sense as a person and that you want to affirm your friendship, that even when you disagree, you value who they are in your life, you value who they are in the community, and you're so glad to know them as a friend. I believe that learning how to welcome people the way that God does, learning how to love, even while we hold to strong, different opinions, will allow our church to be a light of love and grace in our community. Thanks for being part of today. If we can pray for you in any way, please email us, office@bg4.com, elizabeth@bg4.com. We'd love to connect with you on the phone or have coffee. If you have questions about this, because we talked about some controversial things today, and I'm just hoping to start the conversation. If you want to talk more, please reach out to me. Again, elizabeth@bg4.com. I'm so grateful for you choosing to be part of the community by being here today. For our regular givers, you can always give online at bg4.com or text to give. Or you can come join us at church and we have a place where you can drop it off. We love you. We're grateful for you. We welcome you with the love of Jesus. Have a great day.